Welcome to the debate. Today we're dissecting a crisis that's, well, it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Homelessness. It is visible on every major street corner in the developed world, yet the solutions seem permanently out of reach. We need to look past the tents and the cardboard signs to understand the machinery behind this, the interplay of definition, economic policy, and human physiology.
It's one of those topics, isn't it? It really forces society to take a hard look at itself. We tend to view this as a logistics issue, a crisis of rooflessness, as you might call it. But looking at the source material, I don't think we're just dealing with a housing shortage. I think we're dealing with a fracture in social identity. We're asking what it means to actually belong to a community.
And that really is the friction point. Is homelessness primarily a structural economic failure, a lack of inventory best solved by unconditional housing, the housing first model? Or is it a symptom of deeper individual fractures, trauma, mental health, addiction, that requires a more conditional treatment-based approach?
I'm taking the stance that the economic view is, well, it's dangerously reductive. Homelessness, to me, is a manifestation of a loss of identity. And if we simply provide four walls without addressing the trauma or the social disconnection, we're not solving the problem. We're just hiding the symptom behind a door.
And I'm going to argue that homelessness is fundamentally a math problem. It is an economic failure. I'll show that housing first isn't just a slogan. It is the only evidence-based solution we have that actually saves taxpayer money and keeps people alive. Viewing housing as a fundamental human right is really the only fiscal path forward.
Fiscal efficiency is a cold comfort if the human inside the house is still broken. But let's look at your math.
All right. Let's start with the scale, because to understand the urgency, we have to look at the numbers. As far back as 2005, global estimates put the homeless population at around 100 million. But looking specifically at the United States, the situation is actively deteriorated. In 2024, the count rose to approximately 771,400 individuals. That is a staggering figure. It's actually surpassed the levels we saw during the Great Recession.
It is a massive number. But I do want to caution against treating that population as a monolith.
Sure. But the drivers, if you look at the drivers, they're remarkably consistent. We are seeing the brutal mechanics of gentrification. Formerly affordable neighborhoods become popular. The wealthy move in, prices skyrocket, and the working poor are just pushed out. You combine that with a stagnation in living wages and the legalese of eviction, and you get a real distortion in the market. It's not a mystery. It's a ledger sheet. When rent burdens exceed income, people fall out of the bottom of the economy.
Okay. I don't deny the rent burden, of course. But if it were purely economic, then why do we see such a high prevalence of these very specific pathologies among the homeless population? You're describing a resource problem. I'm looking at a capability problem.
Because a solution to the resource problem actually helps fix the capability problem. This is where the federal government's Interagency Council on Homelessness landed with the Housing First initiative. The logic is, give people independent housing immediately. No hoops to jump through, no sobriety tests first.
Which sounds, pretty counterintuitive to a lot of people.
It might, until you look at the ROI. A 2013 study by the Central Florida Commission on Homelessness is really the gold standard here. They broke down the cost of not housing people.
The cost of the status quo.
Exactly. It costs that region $31,000 per year to manage a homeless person on the street. That's policing, jail time, emergency room visits for exposure or violence. In contrast, providing permanent supportive housing, so paying their rent and providing a caseworker, costs just $10,051.
So you're saying it's cheaper to give them a house than to arrest them?
Regions chronically homeless would save taxpayers $149 million over a decade. This proves that the moral choice is also the greedy choice. We are spending 3 times as much to criminalize poverty as it would cost to end it.
Okay, that's a compelling spreadsheet, I'll give you that. But you're defining the problem very narrowly to make the math work. You're treating home as a commodity, a physical structure to be supplied. But scholars like Tipple and Speak, they offer a much more nuanced definition. They define homelessness as the antithesis of home.
That sounds a bit academic when we're talking about people literally freezing on concrete.
It's diagnostic, though. Home isn't just shelter, it's a base for nurturing human relationships, for the development of identity. Homelessness is a loss of belonging. So if you treat it only as a logistics issue, shipping container apartments for everyone, you completely miss the pathology. And this is where Housing First, I think, fails the human test.
How does giving someone a secure lock on their door fail the human test?
Because Housing First offers that door without asking for any accountability regarding substance abuse. It prioritizes the roof over the rehabilitation. So while housing retention numbers might look good on paper, critics argue, and I tend to agree, that it essentially encourages rent-seeking behavior without addressing the trauma that put the person on the street in the first place.
But how can you possibly address trauma when you were sleep-deprived and terrified every night?
By acknowledging that the trauma often predates the homelessness. Look at the prevalence of brain injuries. There's a Canadian survey that found that traumatic brain injury, TBI, is incredibly widespread among homeless populations. And crucially, for 70% of those respondents, the brain injury happened before they became homeless.
That is a significant correlation, yes.
Well, it changes the causality, doesn't it? If you have a population where the majority are dealing with severe TBI, or as a study in Hong Kong found, where 56% have some degree of mental illness, just handing them a set of keys is not a solution. It's abandonment. You're putting a person with diminished executive function in a room alone and just saying, good luck.
I think abandonment is a very strong word for providing shelter. I call it the platform for stability. You seem to be advocating for treatment first. Prove you're sober, prove you're taking your meds, then you get a bed. That approach uses an all-or-nothing standard. It demands that people solve their most complex psychological problems while living in a tent.
I'm not suggesting they stay in the tent. I'm suggesting the housing must be conditional on treatment. Otherwise, it just enables the addiction.
But the data shows the conditional approach fails. People can't comply. Look at Boston, Massachusetts. In 2010, they reported that the Housing First initiative significantly reduced the chronic homeless single-person population. It was so effective they were actually able to close emergency shelter facilities like the Boston Night Center. That isn't theoretical. That is a functional reduction in the need for emergency services because people stayed housed.
I'm just wary of equating the closing of a shelter with the solving of a problem. You might have reduced the visible count, but have you reintegrated those people? Without addressing what some scholars call the loss of usual relationships with the mainstream, just placing someone in an apartment doesn't solve social exclusion. It's what Moore described back in 2007 as the loss of identity. You are, in effect, warehousing people. They're out of sight, so the public assumes the problem is fixed.
Warehousing implies we're just storing them. I'd argue we're keeping them alive so they can reintegrate, because the alternative is what we're seeing right now, the active criminalization of existence. I mean, if we don't provide housing and we don't allow them on the street, where do they go?
The legal landscape is certainly shifting toward enforcement.
Shifting is a polite word for it. It's a crackdown. In June 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 to permit cities to criminalize homeless camps. This ruling allows bans on public camping to be enforced even when there's no government-provided shelter available. Then Florida followed this up in October 2024 with HB 1365, prohibiting sleeping on public property. We're legally mandating that people just disappear into thin air.
It is harsh, I agree, but we have to look at why that sentiment is so popular. It's not just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's a reaction to the clash over public space. Municipalities are trying to manage public safety. You see this in so-called hostile architecture, the spikes in London doorways or the low overpasses Robert Moses designed in New York to prevent buses and therefore the poor from accessing certain beach areas.
But those are aggressive tactics designed to make human beings feel unwelcome in their own cities.
They're defensive tactics. The housed population often views the homeless as safety threats or even, as some sociological literature suggests, as pathogens. It's a very primal psychological reaction to disorder. Cities are trying to reclaim public space for the tax-paying majority.
But that stigma is lethal. It drives depression and victimization. A 2007 study showed that violent crimes against homeless people are on the rise. When you use hostile architecture or pass laws like those in Hungary or Russia, where there were reports in 2022 of homeless people being targeted for conscription into the war in Ukraine, you are stripping them of humanity. You're saying their lives are currency to be spent or trash to be swept away.
I agree that the stigma is incredibly damaging, but I think your defense of the homeless is too Western-centric. You're picturing a specific type of person, likely the American model of the single male on a park bench. If we want to solve this, we have to look at the global diversity of the issue. The very definition of home and homeless shifts radically when you cross borders.
Poverty is poverty, isn't it?
Not necessarily. Look at Japan. Homelessness there is primarily a phenomenon among middle-aged and elderly men. This demographic shift peaked in the 90s due to the collapse of the asset price bubble. It's a specific generation left behind by an economic crash. Now compare that to China, where homelessness is tied to the hukou system.
The household registration system.
Right. Migrant workers move to Beijing or Shanghai for labor, but because their registration is rural, they have no rights to social services in the city. The massive evictions in Beijing in 2017 weren't just about housing shortages. They were about managing population flow. Those people aren't necessarily addicts or mentally ill in the way you might characterize the U.S. population. They are legally excluded laborers.
But the result is the same. No roof.
But the result is different forms of exclusion. In India, you don't just see isolated individuals, you see entire families, 5 generations deep, living on the streets. This isn't the social isolation we talk about in the West, it's a different form of community survival. Or consider the net cafe refugees in Japan.
Right, I've read about them, living in 24-hour internet cafes.
Exactly. So they have a roof, technically, they have internet, they have a reclining chair, but they lack a home. They represent a continuum of homelessness. A policy like Housing First, just giving them a permanent apartment key, doesn't necessarily fix the complex legal exclusion of a migrant worker in Beijing or the social nuance of a net cafe refugee.
That's a fair point on cultural nuance, but I would argue that biology overrides culture. Regardless of whether it's China, India, or the US, the physiological toll of not having a private, secure space is universal. You can debate the definition of home, but the definition of hypothermia doesn't change.
Biology is universal, sure.
The United Nations defines the problem as a lack of adequate housing, and we have to look at the health impacts. We are talking about conditions like street feet, immersion foot syndrome from wet socks, scabies, the increased vulnerability to the heat island effect in urban areas.
The physical toll is undeniable.
It's catastrophic. A report from the charity Crisis in 2011 found that homeless people in the UK have a life expectancy of just 47 years. That's 30 years lower than the average population. 30 years! So whether you're a migrant laborer in Beijing or a rough sleeper in London, the lack of physical shelter is killing you, and that necessitates a physical solution, housing, over a theoretical one about belonging. We can't build a sense of identity for a corpse.
See, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it creates a false dichotomy. You're prioritizing survival, keeping the heart beating, which is valid, of course, but you're ignoring what makes that life sustainable long-term. If we house people but ignore the lack of belonging, we are merely keeping them alive in isolation.
Reintegration starts with survival. You cannot reintegrate a dead person.
But let's look at the predictors. If we want to actually stop homelessness, not just manage it, we have to look way upstream. We have to look at childhood. The literature shows such a strong link to foster care transitions. Youth leaving the system often have no support, no income. We see physical and sexual abuse in childhood as major predictors. These experiences stunt the development of relationship-building skills.
I don't deny those causes, but we have to deal with the adults standing in front of us today.
But if you simply provide a house at age 40, you're not fixing the developmental trauma from age 4. We need to address the definition of home as a base for nurturing human relationships. If the person cannot form those relationships due to untreated schizophrenia or TBI, the housing will eventually fail. They'll be evicted again or they'll abandon the unit. The Housing First model might save money in the short term, but does it feel the person?
It saves money and lives. And frankly, in a world where we are facing a cost of living crisis, where U.S. numbers have surpassed 2007 levels in 2023, we need efficiency. We need solutions that scale. We don't have enough psychiatrists to treat every trauma before we hand out a key.
And I argue that efficient solutions that ignore human complexity aren't solutions at all. They're stopgaps.
So, as we wrap up, I want to reaffirm my position. Homelessness is a violation of the right to an adequate standard of living, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Whether the cause is the lingering effects of the Great Recession, the 2023 cost of living crisis, or expiring COVID-era protections, the data is clear. Housing first and rapid rehousing are not just the most humane paths, they are the most fiscally responsible. We could save $149 million in a decade in one region alone. The numbers just don't lie.
And I'll conclude by saying that while housing is necessary, it is woefully insufficient. If we focus only on the economics, we miss the human being. We must look at the childhood predictors, the abuse, the foster care system. We must look at the neurological reality of traumatic brain injuries. We have to view home not as a structure, but as a place of identity and relationship. If we don't address the lack of belonging, we're just treating the symptom and ignoring the disease.
It's a tension, isn't it, between the immediate need for survival and the long-term need for community.
Exactly. And despite all our global wealth, the fact that these numbers are rising, that we're seeing U.S. numbers climb back past 2007 levels, it suggests that our current understanding, or perhaps our current compassion, is falling short.
There are certainly more to explore in the material. Thank you for joining the debate.